Okay, good afternoon, everyone. As I just said, this meeting is being recorded, and the recording of this presentation and the slide deck that I'm going to share with you will be made available on the OSSE website. So, good afternoon. My name is Ryan Arori, and I am the Senior Advisor for Budget and Finance at OSSE. And today we are going to be talking about the LEA financial reporting application. And our agenda will include just a brief overview of the financial data collection. And then I'll get into some updates for this year's reporting. And then I will go into detail about both the per pupil expenditure reporting and the maintenance of effort reporting. Then I'll do a brief demonstration of the actual QuickBase application. Following that will be some next steps. I will share additional resources, and then I will open it up to Q&A. So if you have any questions, you can use the chat feature. And if you are using the chat feature, just make sure that your chat message is going to everyone so that I can see it. And I have a window open that so I can see all the chats as they come in. So what is the financial data collection? The financial data collection, this is our annual data collection process in which LEAs submit financial data to OSSE in order to meet two requirements. One is the per pupil expenditures requirement, and the other is the maintenance of effort requirement. These two requirements were the result of something that was passed in the Every Student Succeeds Act, which was signed into law in 2015. All LEAs are required to submit their financial data to OSSE, and this data submission will be done through a QuickBase application, and that QuickBase application actually opened on December 14th, and LEAs will have until March 14th to March 14th, 2022 is the deadline. And I see that there is a chat already from Atima. Yes, we will be making these slides available. This session's also being recorded, so the recording and the slide deck will both be available on the OSSE website once I wrap up this meeting. So this is an annual data collection, and LEAs will only need to submit information for this data collection process once per year. And this is actually the third year that we have been collecting this financial data from LEAs. So, and the final bullet point, as I said, the financial data will be submitted via a data input into the LEA financial reporting application, which I will give you a demonstration of later in the presentation. So for updates for this year, the good news is that there actually are no major updates to the data collection process for this year. We did some pretty significant ones last year, and because of that, the system is actually running well and the process works really well. So the data collection process will be similar to last year's process. I guess the only major update is that LEAs will be submitting their financial data for the school year, for the 2020-21 school year, which is also known as fiscal year 21. And as what happens each year, the maintenance of effort calculation will use the financial data that was submitted in the preceding fiscal year. So the application has been updated to reflect that the maintenance of effort calculation will be comparing your FY20 financial expenditures with your newly submitted FY21 financial expenditures. And as you'll see when I do the demonstration, this calculation is done automatically in the application itself. So before I do a application demonstration, I'm just going to run really quickly through what the two requirements are. So the first one is the per pupil expenditures reporting. And the financial data that is collected from LEAs will be used to report your per pupil expenditure data for each LEA and for each school within your LEA. This is a federal requirement, so every state education agency, every district, every LEA, and every school in the country needs to meet this requirement. And the reason for collecting this data is that it can be used by families, school leaders, policymakers, and other stakeholders. And it's an opportunity for the public to compare school expenditures with other publicly available data points for all public schools in the district. Uh, it is important for me to note that the per pupil expenditure data is not used by OSSE for any statewide accountability purposes. It is just an additional data point that is available for the public. And the data will be reported on the DC School Report Card website, as we have done for the past 2 years. So this is the third year that this data will be made available on the DC School Report Card website. This is what is in the law. So in the Elementary and Secondary Education Act of 1965, as amended by ESSA in 2015, the per pupil expenditures of federal, state, and local funds, including actual personnel expenditures and actual non-personnel expenditures of federal, state, and local funds, disaggregated by source of funds for each local education agency and each school in the state for the preceding fiscal year. So that's a long sentence, but basically what it means is that we will be reporting your per pupil expenditures broken out into two categories, federal and then state and local. In the district, since state and local is essentially the same thing, we just wrap that into one. And expenditures will be reported based on the LEA's audited fiscal year data. So that's why we had to wait until December to open up the application, because of the charter LEAs and DCPS don't have audited data until then. So that's why, even though this is for the 2020-2021 school year, there's a bit of a lag as we have to wait for your audited fiscal year data to be ready. So LEAs are also required to report their actual expenditures. What this generally just means is that budgeted expenditures or average expenditures should not be reported. When you're doing your reporting, you should be doing your actual expenditures. There's a confusing line in the law that talks about personnel and non-personnel expenditures. I just want to clarify that expenditures do not need to be broken out between personnel and non-personnel expenditures. We don't collect them that way, so just to make that clear that they're not broken out, even though it's poorly worded in the actual law, in the language of the law. Per pupil expenditures will be calculated by dividing the school's expenditures by the enrollment audit student count. And this is done automatically within the application. And the third year of per pupil expenditure reporting will be based on the financial data from the 2020-2021 school year, as I mentioned. So when you're doing your data collection, there are certain expenditures that should not be included when we do our per pupil expenditure calculation, but will still be reported as an aggregate amount. These are referred to as our excluded expenditures. And just to briefly describe this, these are typically expenditures that are not necessarily within like the normal day-to-day operation of a school. So, for example, construction and capital improvements. If an LEA is doing a massive construction project and spending millions of dollars on building a new school building, if we included those expenditures in our per pupil calculation, it would like make it look like a very high per pupil amount for that year, and would essentially like not be a very good comparison to other schools and to that school's data from previous years. So the purpose of excluding these expenditures is to just make sure that we have sort of like a normalized per pupil expenditure calculation for each LEA and for each school. Even though these are excluded expenditures, they're excluded from the per pupil calculation, but each LEA will still be required to report what their excluded expenditures were for the fiscal year. So the list of expenditures that will be excluded are debt service, capital expenditures, construction and capital improvements, community service operations, supplemental expenses made as a result of a presidentially declared disaster, and expenditure sourced from private funds. So there's no change from the previous 2 years in how we've collected the excluded expenditure data, but again, we're just continuing as we have been in the past. So this is just a really quick example of what your school expenditure reporting would look like for a single site LEA. So the boxes in blue are the data that you will be submitting to OSSE through the application. So you'll see in this example, school one has $1 million of federal expenditures and $12 million of state and local expenditures for a total of 13 million for school level expenditures. And the school also has $2 million of excluded expenditures. So the total school spending for the fiscal year is $15 million. But when we're doing our per pupil expenditure calculation, as you'll see with the blue arrow, we are only taking the federal and the state and local school expenditures and dividing those numbers by the school's enrollment audit count to get the per pupil expenditure amount. So in this example, the $1 million is divided by 700 students, and the $12 million is also divided by the 700 students to get the total per pupil expenditure amount. So if you are a multiple site LEA, there's a little bit of additional reporting that is collected from you in the application. And this is because OSSE wants to ensure that all applicable expenditures are included in the school per pupil expenditure calculation. So LEAs that have multiple schools and/or have a central office may have expenditures that do not apply directly to the school level, or that or there's expenditures that apply to multiple schools, and we refer to these as the LEA centralized expenditures. So quick example, if there's salaries of central office staff, those are not expenditures that are like specifically at the school level. So we want to make sure that those expenditures that we are calling centralized expenditures are included in the reporting. So OSSE believes that LEAs are the most knowledgeable about their school level and centralized level expenditures, and therefore it is at the LEA's discretion as to how centralized expenditures are allocated to the school level. So LEAs must show the amount of centralized expenditures that are allocated to each school, and LEAs must also provide their methodology for applying centralized expenditures to each school. So here's just a couple examples. So an LEA, again, has the flexibility to determine how centralized expenditures are allocated to the school level. These are just a couple examples, so I'll just go through one or two. So the first one is a per pupil basis, and this is for centralized services that benefit all students across all schools. These expenses can be allocated to schools on a per pupil basis. So an example is the salary, um, and the non-personnel expenses of like the executive office. Those could be allocated across all students in the school system. There's also like, you could also do it via a per staff basis, and that would essentially be all centralized services that benefit all staff across the entire organization. These expenses can be allocated to schools on a per staff basis. And the example of this is the Human Resources Office. So if you have a centralized Human Resources Office, you could allocate those expenses based on the number of staff that is at each school. So this is just the same example where we're breaking out the expenditures by school for each school in a multi-site LEA. So this is the blue boxes again are the data that is provided by the LEA. The green boxes are just the calculated cells. And in this example, you'll see that there's school level expenditures for each school, but then there's also the school's share of centralized expenditures. And everything will total up to give you your total school expenditures. And then LEAs will also be required to input their excluded expenditures. And you'll see in this example that the LEA's excluded expenditures are aggregated at the LEA level because they're not applied to each of the schools. And then you'll see the total the total LEA expenditures basically totals up all of the school expenditures and all of the excluded expenditures. So this is what the per pupil expenditures would look like in this example. So what I did was just using the data from school one. This is the per pupil expenditures that would be displayed for school one. And then in the next column is what the LEA's per pupil expenditures would look like. So just for the timeline for the data collection for this year, as I said, December 14th is when our collection portal opened. LEAs will have until March 14th at 4 p.m. to submit their data. Over the rest of March, OSSE will just verify the data for accuracy and completeness. And that's essentially just me looking at the data to make sure it looks correct and making sure that if I saw any like boxes of data that might have been missing, like if there was a 0 in there, like I would reach out to your LEA and just ask you to just verify that that is correct. And then in May of this year, we will update our report card to include all of the financial data. So really quickly, I'm going to also talk about the maintenance of effort requirement. So the financial data that's collected by OSSE will also be used to ensure that charter LEAs are meeting the new maintenance of effort requirements. I say new, but this is the third year now that we will be doing the maintenance of effort requirement check. So what is maintenance of effort? It requires that subgrantees that are receiving federal funds to maintain a minimum floor of state and local funding for education from year to year. The DC School Reform Act of 1995 had originally exempted DC charter schools from having to meet the maintenance of effort requirement, but ESSA that was passed, the ESSA that was passed in 2015 amended that act to remove this exemption. So starting with the FY18 and FY19 school years is when we first started to do the MOE requirements, and we continue to do so each year as we're collecting your data. So last year was the second year of reporting for MOE, and this is the third year that OSSE will be collecting MOE reporting information. And just a quick note that the maintenance of effort that we are testing for when we do the data collection and in the QuickBase application is for a number of ESEA grants. It is not for the IDEA MOE requirement. Those requirements remain the same and are handled separately through your IDEA grants manager. So a subgrantee may receive federal funds from a covered program for a fiscal year only if OSSE finds that either there's an aggregate state education expenditure or a per pupil state expenditure test. Basically, what we're testing for is that from the previous fiscal year, your state and local expenditures are at least 90% as high as the preceding fiscal year. So as I said, there's two different tests. There's two different ways to look at this. There's the aggregate way and there's the per pupil way. And as long as your LEA meets one of the two, then your LEA essentially like passes the MOE requirement for that year. And at the bottom of this slide, just lists some of the covered programs that are included in that LEAs would have in which they would need to meet the MOE requirement. So if your LEA receives Title 1A, Title 1D, Title 2A, Title 3A, Title 4A, or Title 4B, then you need to meet the MOE requirement. If your LEA does not receive funding from any of the covered grant programs, then you don't need to meet the MOE requirement. Like this test is not for your LEA if you don't meet any of these. And so the financial data application was designed so that MOE data will be collected from the data that is being used for the per pupil expenditure reporting. So, and we are also using the financial data that we collected from LEAs last year to do our comparison to the data that will be submitted this year. And OSSE will review MOE expenditure reports before providing LEAs their preliminary allocations for next year's ESEA funds. So that would be in summer of 2022. And I'll pause because I see there's another question. Has there been any news or discussion around a waiver for this MOE requirement in light of all the ESSER and other federal COVID-related grant funding? That's a great question. To my knowledge, there has not been a sort of like a blanket waiver that the U.S. Department of Education has given to OSSE or to any other state. But there is a waiver process that LEAs could use if it did turn out that they didn't meet the MOE requirement. And yes, we understand that there has been a lot of federal funding going out to LEAs over the past years and for the years to come, which may um, have an effect on the MOE reporting because a lot of LEAs will be spending a lot more federal funds and a lot less local funds. So at this point, again, there's no blanket waiver or anything, but we might be able to work with the U.S. Department of Education on an individual basis with LEAs if it actually turns out that there are LEAs that are not meeting the maintenance of effort requirements. So if a subgrantee fails to meet the maintenance of effort requirements, they also need to have failed to meet MOE once before within the 5 immediately preceding fiscal years in order for there to be like a trigger for any reduction of federal funds or anything. So basically, if this is the first year that your LEA does not meet MOE, then nothing happens for this year. But if you also fail to meet MOE in the following 5 years, then that's when the trigger would happen and your federal funding would be adjusted. So again, OSSE, we will not penalize DC charter LEAs that fail to meet MOE for the first time for this year, unless you also fail to meet MOE again within the next 5 years, beginning with FY22. And as I just said, there's also a federal waiver. So the U.S. Department of Education may waive this requirement only in cases of exceptional or uncontrollable circumstances, such as natural disaster, change in the organizational structure of the agency, or precipitous decline in the agency's financial resources. So at the time of this presentation, we have not received any waiver guidance related to the MOE requirement from the Department of Education about COVID-19. So again, we will work with you and your LEA if anything did happen with your MOE requirements to see if a waiver could be granted by the U.S. Department of Education. So when we're calculating the FY20 MOE expenditures, basically what we're doing is we're just totaling up all of the state and local expenditures that you're submitting in the application and comparing it to the state and local spending from the prior year, which you submitted last year. So we're taking the data that you submitted last year and comparing it to the data that you're submitting this year to do the MOE test. And when I go through again the application walkthrough, I'll show you where that MOE calculation is done. It's done automatically within the application. But this slide is just showing an example of what we're doing when we're doing the MOE calculation. So in this example, in the preceding fiscal year, in FY20, the LEA spent $1 million of state and local funds, And on a per pupil basis, that ended up being $6,100. So the amount that the LEA needs to spend in FY21 in order for them to maintain effort is 90% of that $1 million. So in the following fiscal year, the LEA needs to spend at least $900,000 of state and local funds in order to meet MOE. And if we were doing it on the per pupil basis, then that would be $5,490. So if you look at line 3, the LEA actually only spent $850,000 of state and local funds and $5,200 on a per pupil basis. So they actually did not meet MOE because they failed both of the aggregate expenditure test and the per pupil test. So in this case, if the LEA fails to meet MOE again over the next 5 years, then there would be a reduction to the LEA's federal funds allocation. I don't see any other questions in the chat, so I am going to jump over and open my internet browser and open up the application. So just bear with me for 1 sec. I'm going to stop sharing and start sharing my internet browser. So just let me know if you cannot see that. Or if it's too small. Actually, let me see if I can make this a little bigger. Okay, so when you go into the application and log in, this is the home page that you'll see. And the most important thing that if you are lost, if you don't know how to fill out this application, if you forget everything that I have told you during this webinar, this link right here is the link for you. This is the step-by-step instructions to complete your financial data submission. And if you click this link, it'll open up a PDF where I lay out all of the instructions for how to complete this application. So this is a great resource for you as you're going through, especially if it's your first time filling out this application. These instructions are step by step what to do to complete this to complete the data submission in this application. But I'll walk through them right now, just for everybody. And when you open up the application, the menu is these top 4 blue buttons that will navigate you to the different sections of the application. And to do your data submission, you'll go to the LEA Expenditure data button. And when you go here, it will load up this box that has the LEA Expenditure Data Summary, and your LEA will be listed here. So in this example, we have OSSE Academy. So what you'll do is you'll click on OSSE Academy, and then your data page will appear. So there's a couple things that I want to point out on this page. The LEA name and the LEA code will be listed right here. And then there is this box, the LEA Excluded Expenditures. This is one of the boxes that you'll need. This is the box where you will fill in your total aggregated excluded expenditures. And then next to it is the state local expenditures for maintenance of effort for FY20. So this is the amount that your LEA spent from state and local expenditures from the 1920 school year. And this number comes from the data that your LEA submitted last year in the data collection. So when you scroll down, you'll see all of your schools in your LEA. And this is where you will be entering in your data. And the way that you will do that is by clicking on the edit button. So clicking on the edit button will bring you to a new page where you will be able to type in your school's expenditure data. So as I said before, your excluded expenditures for FY21 will go in this box. So in this example, I'll just put in $1 million for excluded expenditures. And then you'll scroll down and you'll need to fill in for each school, your financial expenditure data. And you will do that in these 4 columns: the school level expenditures federal, your school level expenditures state and local, your school share of centralized expenditures federal, and your school share of centralized expenditures state and local. So it's very easy to submit. All you have to do is highlight the box and type in your amount. And then you can tab, you can click whatever you want and just go across and type in the data. And as you go through and type the information, you'll see that all of the boxes to the right will start to populate with the data that you've submitted. So for the data that I just submitted for the OSSE Academy Elementary School, I just typed in $3.2 million of school expenditures, and the application automatically calculates the per pupil amount. So the enrollment count from FY21, this pulls from the enrollment audit data that OSSE has, and it divides all of your expenditure data by the student count to get your per pupil data. So in this example, there's about $7,000 of state and local, $6,000 of per pupil federal, and $13,000 per pupil total. And if you'd like, you can continue to scroll across where we just break down that same information in different ways. There's some percentages here and some other breakdowns of the per pupil amounts. All of this data in these cells is the data that will be shared on the DC School Report Card website. So as you are entering in your information in these cells, all of this will pre-populate, and all of this data is the data that will be made public on the DC School Report Card website. So real quickly, I'll just enter in some more numbers here. I'm just gonna do it real quick. And just entering in random numbers to get the totals. And these boxes in yellow, these are all the boxes that you would need to fill in. If your LEA only has one school, or if you don't have any centralized expenditures, you could just put zeros in these boxes. But if your school is a multi-site LEA and if you have centralized expenditures, then you would want to make sure that there's numbers filled into these cells. So I'm just going to type just some random numbers in here for now. So again, the excluded expenditures up here at the top, and then these 4 columns for each of your schools, that's all you would need to do to submit your expenditure data. And when you scroll down, you'll see that all of the data that you submit, or actually, hold on, let me just move my window. First, you should save and close this, and it takes a moment to save. And you'll see that it saved all the data that I submitted. And then if you scroll down further, it tabulates your LEA. So it basically adds up all of your school information to get your LEA information. So the one other thing that you need to submit is go back to the home screen, is the centralized methodology. So the centralized methodology is a Word file that you open up where you will type in your methodology for how you allocated your centralized expenditures. And I will just share this with you real quick. So I'm going to need to share the document that I just opened. So when you download that file, you'll download a Word file that looks like this. Make it a little bit bigger so everyone can see. And this is the same file that you've had to fill out for the past 2 years, where you'll just type in your LEA code, your LEA name, then you will check a box. If you do not have centralized expenditures, you would check this box, and then you stop filling out the form. You don't need to do anything else. If you do have centralized expenditures, you would check this box and then scroll down, and this is where you provide your narrative summary for how you allocated your centralized expenditures to each of your schools. So you would fill this out and save it. And I'm going to close out of this and go back to the application. So after you have filled out that template, you would just upload it by hitting this button and go through this process here of uploading your document. So you would just select your LEA, select your centralized methodology, and then just browse and find the file and upload it. And I'll just do that really quick. And then when you save and close, it'll save and upload the document for you. So after you've uploaded the document, after you've entered all of your data's information in the application, the last thing that you need to do is certify and submit. So the certify and submit page is where you have the opportunity just to do one final review of all of the information, and it will show the LEA expenditure data summary. It will show the school level expenditure summary. It will show your maintenance of effort summary. So in this case, the OSSE Academy met MOE because they spent more local funds in this year than they did in the preceding fiscal year. And it shows the 2 MOE tests. So there's the aggregate expenditure test where it shows the aggregate local expenditures and compares it to the previous years to show that the LEA met the aggregate expenditure test, or you can look at the per pupil expenditure test and look at the total local expenditures divided by the school's audited enrollment count. So when you review all of this information, it shows all of the information that will appear on the school report card website. And if it all looks good to you, you can check the box that says you certify that the data is correct and accurate. And then you would hit save and close, and then you are done. Then you can exit out. So I am going to just bring back up the presentation. So if there's any questions, if there's anything you want me to walk through again in the application, just let me know and I can pull it back up. But for now, I'm just going to continue. So next steps. So again, LEAs will submit their financial data within the application by March 14th. OSSE will share updates and reminders leading up to that deadline. You'll see these updates and reminders in the LEA look forward. The DC School Report Card website will be updated to include all of the financial data that you submit, and that update will happen in May of this year. And resources will also be made available to the public in May so that they have a full understanding of what they are looking at when they are looking at the per pupil expenditure data that is on the report card. So So one other thing to note is that the common financial reporting standards were announced by the Deputy Mayor for Education in May of 2021. These are new financial reporting standards that will be used starting with the 2022-2023 school year, so fiscal year 23. OSSE will begin collecting financial data aligned with these new standards in 2024. So there will be no changes to the current financial data collection process for this year and for next year, but 2 years from now, the financial data that OSSE collects from LEAs will change and will be aligned to the common financial reporting standards. So that's just a note that this is a change that is coming in the future, but is not coming yet. We still have 2 years to go before OSSE will start collecting the financial data from LEAs in a slightly different way that is based on the common financial reporting standards. And when you're reviewing this presentation, you can click on this link that will take you to the DME's website. That is a document that explains what the common financial reporting standards are. But this is just a note that for this year and for next year, there will be no changes to how we are collecting the financial data from LEAs, but starting in 2024, there will be a change. So if you need additional resources as you're completing this data collection requirement, this is the slide that has all of that information. So you have a link to the application itself. You have a link to the guidelines for the per pupil expenditures reporting. There's a link for the maintenance of effort guidelines for the maintenance of effort reporting. There's a link to the DC School Report Card website. There's a link to the DC School Report Card and STAR Framework Technical Guide, which shows how we do all of the calculations that are on the DC School Report Card, including the per pupil expenditure calculations. And then the OSSE grants and funding resources. So on our website, we have a section specifically for grants and funding resources, and this is where you'll find any information about the LEA financial data collection. So those are all the slides that I have. So if anybody has any questions, now is a good time to ask. And while you're typing that out, if you have one, you can do it in the chat. Or for folks that are watching a recording, you can email me. My information is here. It's ryan.arori@dc.gov. And those are all of the slides that I have for you today. So thank you for listening and learning about the LEA financial data collection. I'll just go back to my contact information. If you have any questions or any issues accessing the application or filling out the data for the application, you can send me an email. Just make sure that you give yourself enough time to complete this requirement. It is due on March 14th, but if there's an issue that you come across on March 14th, I don't know if I will be able to fully help you. So please log into the application before then. Make sure you have access to the application and that you have the ability to go in and edit the cells in the application. But you can email me if you have any technical issues before March 14th. So I don't see any additional questions in the chat. So with that, I will hang around for a minute or two, but thank you for attending and look forward to seeing all of your submissions on March 14th. So thank you.